the longer I do this work of building, leading, advising, and letting go, the more I'm starting to understand how much I still have to learn. Um, and and when I say that, I don't mean it's not the business mechanics, it's not the how, as much as it is how do you create something that's sustainable, um, and and it doesn't break you in the process. So have been thinking a lot about those types of things lately. And so I think one of the things I wanted to do as part of this podcast was, um, start to talk about some of the elements of disruption, and what that means, and why the themes that we chose for this series of episodes, this journey that we're on, why it's important. And I think this idea of disruption, when you're a disruptor, when you don't get that title. That's not something you call yourself. That's not an occupation. But the more I've had the chance to build things, the more I've understood that, oftentimes that's how you either get labeled, or sometimes that is the thing you have to do. You have to break existing systems. You have to challenge existing norms. And I think talking about kind of the journey that we've been on, I've some people around me that I've got a lot of respect for who are doing this right now, this build in public, this idea of, sharing the thoughts, the raw ideas of, what's going on while you're doing it. Dan Smith over at the Border House KC, Tony Caudill at Doozy, um, I really have a lot of admiration in what they do, and I understand it to be somewhat therapeutic. So you might be on a, mental health journey with me right now. Who knows? But we'll see. And so wanted to kind of reflect on some of the things, more specifically I've been thinking about, now that you understand why we're doing this. But I want to be clear, these aren't things I've learned. These are things I'm still learning. And there's 4 topics, there's 4 categories of things I've been thinking a lot about lately of, how I'm learning, unlearning, and still trying to figure out how to get it right. So I think the first one is, this idea that, success and chaos often look the very same at the beginning. Whether it's mayhem or momentum, they often look identical, when you're early, when you're, building something raw, when it's the definition and the clarity aren't there yet. It's hard to tell the difference between, that chaos, that mayhem, and momentum, and what those things mean. I can think of in my own experience, and what got me really thinking about this is some of the things that we've been going through recently with this initiative, some of the wins we've had. It gives you the opportunity, or puts you in a position where you have to retell kind of the story. And one of the things that's been coming up a lot lately is how we had gone through a year and a half of planning and had, some pretty solid support across the community, and you could, there was definitely marked momentum. There was definitely a feeling of progress in a short amount of time. And we went through this process to define who our board should be, and these subcommittees that were going to help us lead the organization forward. And it brought in some folks that had a lot of experience doing this type of work to kind of set the stage and provide the structure, and the best practices, and understand, do the interviews in our community, the community engagement, to understand what people expected and wanted from something like this. So it was the plan was going as you would expect. And we announced our board of directors and the subcommittees on March 11th of 2020, which, I just think that's the worst day in history, at least in my lifetime, that you could launch a placemaking initiative. The next day we're in the first stages of a global pandemic, and place was one of the first things that people said was over. And so for this initiative, for the work we were doing, it was highly chaotic. For the entire world, that was one of the most chaotic periods. And yet, by kind of persevering through that and understanding the difference between the chaos and the mayhem, and how we could continue to use that as a pivotal moment for us, is how we came out of the backside of that thing. And so the opportunity to There are two things really. The first one was, the demonstration of resilience. I think in our community engagement conversations, there was a lot of feedback about organizations or initiatives that had started and did not sustain, especially when the first challenges came along. And so I think our ability to, weather that storm, stay on plan, stay on point, and be here, I think has been an opportunity for us to demonstrate, that resilience and that commitment to our mission. And I think the second thing is there was a lot of feedback that this was a real estate play. And, the belief and the imperative of the organization was that this is programming and placemaking, and the real estate would follow. Ultimately, it's a tool, it's an instrument to create the community that, becomes the catalyst for the economic mobility and the innovation growth and the entrepreneurial venture support. And when real estate's taken off the table indefinitely and also becomes extremely challenging on the backside, we've had to live out that and be validated by that belief, and has really kind of solidified it in who we are and how we're seen and what we do. And so I think those were, that early chaos, that early feeling of uncertainty certainly was something that became, I think, a pivotal point for us. And we gained some clarity through that process. And I think the other, one of the other elements of this I've learned is throughout some of the leadership experience that I've had is, clarity comes later. Clarity is not something that, if you feel like you know all the answers early, that's, the process of customer discovery, the process of, being able to adapt early and be able to change course ever so slightly or significantly depending on what you find out and discover when you're early in the process. That's what gives you the clarity, and it's always, what do they say, hindsight's 20/20. So it just makes sense, and I think understanding that when you're early and understanding that when you're going through the starting stages is important. And just remember, people outside the room see growth when everybody inside the room sees uncertainty. And so every now and then it is important to step back and look at the progression and look at the macro view when you're stuck in the day-to-day. Because certainly it's emotionally destabilizing, and it creates a feeling of emotional dissonance when we call it the roller coaster. But what does that mean? That just means that you can't get too high on the early success because you don't trust the momentum. And it's important to keep that in mind, but it's also, I think, one of those things that you still, where is the balance between being okay with the uncertainty, being okay with the lack of clarity, and still looking at the milestones and celebrating the successes and trying to build that momentum. Those I think are tough things to do. So I think just for me, the learning right now is just remember, when it's chaotic, it doesn't mean it's wrong, but it doesn't mean it's working either. So I think that is kind of the first big thing. And the other thing I've been thinking a lot about is this idea of system change. We talk about it a lot, and I think you can't build a new system with the same old thinking. And so, I think we talk about invention, we talk about innovation, and it's important to remember that innovation isn't the better app, it's the better question. And it's when you're able to take existing things and use them in new creative ways or new combinations, and that only comes from asking the right question or a different question. And so you have to be able to think about, where are there outdated processes and where are there outdated structures, and how can you change those? When I was earlier in my career, as my first kind of experience as an executive in a product management role at a tech company, we had a relationship where in product we were responsible for the front end R&D would come to us, or we would be doing the market assessments and the external market readouts, and then we would be ideating around opportunities, you know, and then leading the product development and owning product operations. But the endpoints, the customer endpoints for our products, we didn't own. There was customer service or sales or, you know, different types of support organizations. And when the product wasn't working the way it was supposed to, it was difficult. It was a, you know, hierarchical, siloed organizational structure to try to support our products and support our customers. And we knew things had to change. We knew we had to do something different. And so we got everybody in a room all at the same time, and we looked at, you know, tickets together and read what customers had said and understood, started tracking the volume, and we did it all in the same room at the same time, at this, you know, on the same day every week for a while. And when we created this life cycle management forum, it was a way, or the challenge wasn't getting people to come to the meetings, it was getting them to think about solving the problems in a new way, because we were all stuck in an old way of thinking. And you hear people talk about, you know, we've tried this before, we don't do it that way here. Now, if you take that and you amplify that into a civic arena or into the culture of a city, that old thinking is sometimes what creates different, you know, the difficulties in these system changes. And it's, you know, who makes the decisions, who has the influence, and how do you change the thinking there? I think that's oftentimes the challenge. And so I think when I even think about where you've got things that look efficient or look like they're well structured, and you learn that they're not maybe aligned to the users. I'll give you an example in the world we're in right now, and that's innovation district program design. We talk about metrics, you know, the KPIs of new ventures created, jobs created, patents issued, and we, you know, workforce development, KPIs. And what we lose sight of is that these things the success of these things is really underpinned by the culture and the vibrancy and some of the things that are difficult to measure, and so we don't, or they're not. It's hard to benchmark that against another region, because that's what sometimes those measurements are built for, instead of trying to create the underpinning culture of what you want. And I think that's an opportunity, and that's where, you know, we have to think about it in a different way and understand what really drives the outcome. Sometimes it's not what you can easily measure, and we get hung up on that too many times. So sometimes real innovation isn't in the tech, I guess. I think it's, can we give ourselves permission to stop doing what's familiar? So that was the second thing. I think the third thing that's been, you know, been thinking about has been this idea that the founders who win aren't always the loudest. And that's, I think, in this journey of learning and trying to understand, I think this is the one I struggle with the most, because on one hand, I've lived you as a product owner or as an entrepreneur, a founder, you are the champion. You are the salesperson. We preach this and we teach this, and, you know, nobody can own this better than you, especially in the earliest stages. And so where do you cross the line between, you know, being loud and having that be being performant, having that be the thing, versus, you know, your heads down building? Because most of the time the entrepreneurs who are building amazing things are too busy to be loud or have high volume of frequency and those types of things. And so, but at the same time, I've lived and seen the other side of that. If you need that type of narrative and press in order to be successful in your space, then it's hard to understand the differences between those things. You know, and when do you choose impact over visibility? And I think that's, for me, has been one of those things. I think about the number of civic events I haven't gone to, where it would have been great to be in the room, great to have the ability to talk to some of the people who we need as stakeholders and who we think can help as we do this. But at the same time, we're building community, and we have events that we run here, and we have an obligation to keep the doors open and try to do the things. And sometimes you're the only resource to do that, and you have to make that decision of, the impact over visibility. And I think the challenge and the hard part is, what is truly the impact of that on your ability to influence or have success with investors and stakeholders and community. And I think that's one that, instead of listening to the volume, I've been really kind of focusing on the signal. And when I say signal, it's the traction, it's the trust, it's the simplicity of kind of what someone is doing, or the ability to see that, and the persistence. I think those are the other things, and those are the, I think, signals that separate. When you've got people who are building something, sometimes they're invisible until they're undeniable, and I think those signals are the things that indicate who those people most likely are. So, it's. I think this is a tough one, because where is the line? Where is the line between being your best promoter and not keeping your head down enough and building things? And then the last thing, we talk about innovation, and we've been really trying to do our best to put social innovation as, we struggle with sector identity, but there's one sector that absolutely we know needs innovation and hasn't had the investment in innovation, and that's the nonprofit sector. That's the social venture sector. And so, when we think about that innovation in that context, it gets me to thinking about what is our best innovation tool and what is our most underutilized innovation tool, and I think it's empathy. Look, I've watched rooms full of extremely smart people talk themselves out of an obvious answer, because they didn't understand the customer, they didn't understand the end user, they didn't have the perspective of the end user. And so, when I think of real life examples of this, just go back some of the episodes that we've even done recently in this podcast, and you think of Dr. Donetta, and you think of Chris Jones and Tony Caudill, and all of them are doing things based on lived experience, right? The root of that empathy is that they have been the end user. They have been, and in some instances it's, significant and traumatic, and in some instances it's just an annoyance, but it's so frequent and so solvable that's the root of it, and that solving the problem is the thing. And so I think when we get into, corporate or institutional settings, I think there's oftentimes a decision to say that empathy, or that, the ability to devalue lived experience is not strategic, or too emotional, instead of seeing it for what it is, which is, in an early stage, I'm going to bet on the founder every single time, and especially those ones that are driving from a position of empathy. And, one of the challenges in trying to change this mindset, in my opinion, is that we tend to stick meaning to words. And I think of the word conspiracy, and I've been talking a lot when I mentor people, or when I talk to people, I talk about this idea of positive conspiracies, which was something that a gentleman named Steve Fennell taught to me many years ago when I was a telemarketing representative. And it was the idea that if you can behave and do things to create positive conspiracies, and do the work and put in the effort where people are saying good things about you when you're not there, those are positive conspiracies. But in our minds, we have an association to the word conspiracy as something negative. And so I think the same thing is true for the word empathy. And we often tie empathy to being softness and being synonymous with being soft, instead of really understanding what it means, and what it means in the specific context of it. Gives you a unique ability to understand what the real problem is, which is, the core of innovation is being able to ask the right question, being able to understand what the real problem is. So to me, empathy is something to drive precision, not softness. And I see this having the opportunity to work with a lot of social entrepreneurs, a lot of people that are driving forward with social ventures and really trying to understand that intersection between social impact and return on investment. It's been surprising to me to see that the emotional drive and the attachment to the problem and the mission, you can still build amazing things that are sustainable. It doesn't have to be, a purely philanthropic endeavor to do really good things. And so I think empathy is something I've seen in a lot of the best entrepreneurs, and it's undervalued as a primary innovation tool. So, those are the four things I've just been thinking about, recently. Just wanted to share those, the idea of, how to trust the chaos, how to reject the inherited systems, how to, listen for signal over volume, when you're really trying to, pinpoint the core of innovation in those innovators and those entrepreneurs, and then, how do we continue to lead with empathy? And if we're going to have the chance to solve real problems in meaningful ways, that is something that we have to be focused on. So I would say, from my perspective, just to, kind of go back to how I started this, these are things that I've, maybe gotten right once or twice, but I'm still doing wrong quite often and still learning and trying to get better at. Again, I go back to, these aren't lessons I've learned. These are lessons I'm still in the middle of learning. So I think, one thing you can ask yourself at this point is, what are you learning? And what would your work, how would it be different if you decided to be a student longer? And if you kept that curiosity alive, how would the work you do today be different? So with that, I appreciate y'all tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Disruption Lab.